That water belongs to the community now, so you'll want to keep your hands off the valves. That was Diane Pruitt, president of the Stillwater Ridge Homeowners Association, standing on my gravel drive in white sneakers that had never seen a day of work, telling me the pond my grandfather dug by hand in 1951 was no longer mine. The pond sat on my land, behind my fence, fed by a spring that rose under my hill. She had decided it was hers. She had a husband named Roy, who built houses for a living, and she had a fountain going up at the front of their new development that needed water. What she did not know, what she never once thought to check in 3 years of letters and fines and threats, was that I had spent 31 years as a state water rights examiner, and that the decree sitting in my fireproof box predated her subdivision by 70 years. If you owned a thing your family bled for, and a stranger in pearls told you it was community property, what would you have done? My name is Walter Voss. I am 63 years old. For most of my working life, I sat in a gray office at the State Engineers Division and read water decrees, adjudicated claims, and walked disputed ditches with a measuring tape and a level, deciding who had the right to what flow and in what order. There is a particular kind of man who does that work for 31 years and stays. You learn to distrust anyone who raises his voice about water, because the man who is right does not need to raise his voice. He needs only to produce the date. I retired 5 years ago to the 40 acres my family has held in the high country since before the county had paved roads. There is a house my father framed, a barn my grandfather raised, and a pond. The pond is the heart of it. My grandfather dug the basin with a borrowed team and a slip scraper the summer he came home from the Pacific, and he lined the inlet himself with fieldstone he hauled up from the creek bottom, and he registered the spring that fed it with the state because he was a careful man who had learned the paper outlives memory. I have his hands in my memory still, cracked across the knuckles, turning the pages of the county plat book on the kitchen table, showing a boy where the lines ran. He used to say a man who does not know his own corners is just a guest on his own ground. I was that boy. I learned my corners before I learned to drive. My wife Carol loved that pond more than any of us. She swam in it in June when the snowmelt still had teeth, and she taught Maddie to swim there. And on summer evenings, she would sit on the south bank with a glass of iced tea and watch the swallows cut the surface for bugs until the light was gone. She's gone 3 years now, and her ashes are under the willow at the south bank. And I will not pretend that had nothing to do with how hard I held the line. A pond is water and mud and a measured priority date. It is also a place where the people you have lost are still, somehow, sitting on the bank. I did not expect to have to defend both at once. I did not expect a woman in a magenta blazer to make me. I keep records. I have always kept records. It is not a hobby, and it is not paranoia. It is the discipline of a man who spent 3 decades watching disputes turn on whether somebody wrote down a date. I have a manila folder for every fixed thing on this property, and when the trouble started, I opened a new one and labeled it in block letters, and I filed every paper that woman ever handed me. I want to tell you how it went, year by year, because the order matters, and because at the end there is a lesson in it for anyone who has ever stood on their own ground and been told it wasn't theirs. It began the spring after Carol died. A developer had bought the old Hutchins Ranch on the far side of my west fence, 212 acres of sage and aspen, and started carving it into lots for a gated community they called Stillwater Ridge. The name itself was a theft. There is exactly one body of still water on that ridge, and it is mine. Roy Pruitt was the builder. His wife Diane ran the homeowners association that came with the development, and she ran it the way some people run a small kingdom, with a clipboard and a golf cart and a binder of rules she believed applied to the whole valley. The first letter came in May. It was printed on cream stationery with a little embossed logo of a mountain, the kind of paper a person buys to feel official. And it informed me that my property was now, in its words, within the visual corridor of the Stillwater Ridge community, and that my pond, my barn, and my fence were subject to architectural review. I read it twice to be sure I understood the scale of the nerve. I set it on the kitchen table next to my coffee and read it a third time. Slower, the way I used to read a claim that did not add up. Visual corridor. There is no such thing in any statute I enforced for 3 decades. It is a phrase somebody made up to sound like law. I drove down to the county recorder the next morning, a 30-mile run on a road I have driven my whole life, and I pulled the plat for the development and laid it on the counter under the fluorescent light and traced the subdivision boundary with my finger. My 40 acres were not part of their subdivision. They never had been. Their covenants stopped at the survey line my grandfather had walked with a chain in 1949, a line I could have drawn from memory in the dark. The clerk, a woman named Pearl who had worked that counter for 20 years, watched me check it and said quietly that I was the 3rd landowner that month to come in asking the same question about Stillwater Ridge. I wrote that down too. I wrote Diane a short letter, polite, explaining that my parcel was outside her association's jurisdiction and that no review board had any authority over my land. I kept a copy. That was incident 1. She did not write back. She showed up. It was a Tuesday morning in June, a little after 9, when I heard the golf cart on my drive. Diane Pruitt was perhaps 50, slim, with a sharp blonde bob and sunglasses pushed up on her head and a magenta blazer that looked like it cost more than my truck. She had a clipboard. She told me my fence was non-conforming, that the color of my barn was not on the approved palette, and that the pond, and here she actually pointed at it, as if I might not know where it was, would need to be brought into the community water sharing plan. I asked her what water sharing plan. She said the one the board had adopted. I asked her under what authority. She smiled the way you smile at a slow child and said, "Mr. Voss, you're functionally part of our jurisdiction. The sooner you accept that, the easier this goes." I did not raise my voice. I have found that calm is the one thing people like Diane cannot file a complaint about. I told her my land was deeded separate, my water was decreed separate, and she was standing on private property. She left. Before she went, though, she stood at the rail of the south fence and looked at that pond for a long moment. Longer than a person looks at something she only wants to regulate. And I should have understood right then what I did not understand for another year. She did not want to police my pond. She wanted it. I went inside and wrote down the date, the time, every word she said, and I put it in the folder. Incident 2. Here is what I knew that she did not. A water right in this state is not attached to whoever owns the land today. It is attached to a date, the date the water was first put to beneficial use, and the older that date, the more senior the right. Senior rights get their full measure before junior rights get a drop. My grandfather's spring was decreed in 1952 with a priority date of 1951, the year he dug the pond. Stillwater Ridge had filed for its water in a permit dated 2 years ago. In the plain arithmetic of water law, my single quiet pond outranked their entire development. I had spent my career enforcing exactly this principle against people exactly like Roy Pruitt. I did not tell Diane any of this. A man who has examined 1,000 disputes learns that you do not show your hand to someone who is not yet committed to a position they cannot defend. The fine started in the fall. The first notice claimed I owed $200 for the fence. I did not pay it, because you cannot owe a fine to a board that has no authority over you. And I wrote that in a letter and filed the copy. The next month, it was 400, with the original 200 rolled in and a late fee stacked on top. By the end of that first winter, the paper total of fines I supposedly owed the Stillwater Ridge Homeowners Association was $1,100. Every dollar of it invented. None of it collectible, all of it filed in my folder, in date order. Incident count, by my own tally that February, stood at 9. 9 letters, notices, and visits, every one of them photographed and dated, and slid into the manila folder I now had to fasten with a rubber band. My daughter thought I should hire a lawyer. Her name is Maddie, and she was 16 that year, living with me after losing her mother. A tall, serious girl who did her homework at the kitchen table where she could see the pond. She had her mother's habit of going quiet when she was angry, and her grandmother's stubbornness, and somewhere in the year after the funeral, she had decided that the two of us against the world was a thing she could carry. She watched me file each notice without a word, and one night she put down her pencil and asked why I didn't just make it stop. I told her I was making it stop, that I was making it stop the slow way, the way that holds. She looked at me the way teenagers look at a parent they suspect of being too patient to be brave. She did not entirely believe me, so she started photographing things on her own. The golf cart on our drive, the survey stakes that began appearing along our west fence that spring, the cream letters when they came, laid flat on the table with a ruler beside them for scale, because she had seen me do exactly that and assumed it was the correct way. She saved the pictures to her phone and to an old laptop, 2 copies, because she had learned that from me without my ever saying it out loud. I did not ask her to. I came in one evening and found her labeling a folder of her own in block letters, copying my hand. And I had to go back out to the barn for a minute so she would not see my face. I was proud of her, and I was afraid for her, in the way you are afraid for the only person left who is yours. The survey stakes were incident 11, and they were the first thing that frightened me rather than annoyed me. I found them on a Sunday walk, the kind of walk I take every Sunday along my own fence to check the wire in the corners, the habit my grandfather put in me before I could drive. They were not random. They ran in a straight, surveyed line from the low corner of my pond, across the strip of my land nearest the fence, and through a gap in the fence onto the Hutchins ground. Each one was a wood lath driven flush, with a ribbon of pink flagging and a penciled elevation that meant nothing to most people and everything to me. Somebody had shot a grade. Somebody had stood on my land with a level and run a profile down the fall of the hill. I knew what a grade line meant because I had shot 1,000 of them. Water does not move uphill on its own, which meant somebody intended to set a pipe and a pump and pull from the low end of my pond, where the spring's outflow pooled deepest, and run it downhill to the development. I crouched at the first stake and read the penciled number and felt the cold settle in under my ribs, because the elevations told me they were not surveying a fence or property line. They were surveying a pipeline. I photographed every stake, 22 of them, and logged the bearings by eye, and confirmed them the next morning with my own hand level set on a tripod I had not taken out of the closet since I retired. And the line was unmistakable. From the deep corner of the pond, through the fence, down the grade, to the development. They were going to drain my pond to fill their fountain, and they had measured it carefully enough that I knew it was not a whim. It was a plan with a budget behind it. I went to the sheriff's office because I wanted it on record that I had reported it before anything was built. I have learned that the date you first reported a thing is sometimes worth more than the thing itself. The deputy who took the report was a calm young man named Cole, maybe 30, square-shouldered, the kind who writes everything down in a careful hand before he says anything back. He listened to the whole of it, looked at 3 of my photographs, and then told me, honestly, that he could not act on a plan. "Stakes aren't a crime, Mr. Voss," he said. "Survey flags on your own ground are a nuisance, not an offense. If they cut your fence or run a pipe onto your land, that's different. That's trespass, maybe more. You bring me a documented pattern, dates and photos, and a clear physical trespass, and I can do something with it." He tapped my folder where it lay on his desk. He told me the thing that actually decides these cases is not who is angrier or who has the better lawyer. It is who walks in with the record so clean and so complete that there is nothing left for anyone to argue about. He told me to keep doing exactly what I was doing, and to call him the day a pipe touched my dirt, not before and not after. I wrote down what he said, word for word. Incident 12, though it was the first one on my side of the ledger. That summer the pipe went in. They were not subtle. A trencher worked the Hutchins side of the fence for 2 days, and on the 3rd morning I walked my south fence and found that a section of my woven wire had been unstapled from my own posts and rolled back, and a 4-inch line had been laid across 8 feet of my land from a new intake screen sunk in the shallows at the low corner of my pond. Through the fence gap and down the hill toward the development, they had run it onto my ground while I slept. I did not touch it. I want to be very clear about that, because the temptation was enormous and the law was on the side of patience. I photographed it from 9 angles. I measured the distance from the intake to my deeded line, 11 feet inside my property. I noted the date and the time and the make of the pump housing visible on the far side. And I called Maddie out to witness it. And she photographed it too, to her phone and to the laptop. Then I drove to the county and pulled the development's water permit and the AS-built filings, and there it was, in black and white. They had permitted a fountain and a recirculating water feature for the Stillwater Ridge common area. They had not permitted a single drop of new supply. They had no decreed source. They were going to take mine and hope nobody who understood water ever looked. I knew somebody who understood water. I had been him for 31 years. Diane came up the drive the day after the pipe was buried, and this time Roy came with her, a heavy man in a polo shirt with a contractor's sunburn and the easy confidence of a person who has never lost an argument he could shout his way out of. He parked his big SUV across my drive like he owned the gravel. Diane did the talking. She told me the community had completed its water infrastructure and that the pond was now part of the shared system, and that I would be billed a fair share for maintenance. I asked her to say that again so I could write it down accurately, and I held my pen over the folder, and she said it again, slower, pleased that I was finally taking notes like a good neighbor. "The pond," she said, "is functionally part of our jurisdiction, Mr. Voss. The water serves the community now." Roy added that the pipe was on an easement. I asked to see the easement. He said his lawyer had it. I have learned that when a man tells you his lawyer has the document does not exist. A real easement is recorded at the county, and you can hand a man a copy in 5 minutes. I thanked them both and walked them to their car and wrote it all down. Every word, the date, the time, the make of the truck. Incident 15. And the first time the antagonist's husband had put himself on the record claiming a right to my water. I want to tell you about the fountain, because the fountain is the whole story in miniature. It went up at the entrance to Stillwater Ridge that August, a 3-tier stone thing the size of a small house, lit at night, throwing up a plume you could see from the county road. It was the centerpiece of every brochure Roy printed. The lots that backed up to the fountain green sold for $40,000 more than the ones that didn't. The fountain was not decoration. It was the product. And the fountain ran on my pond, through 11 feet of unpermitted pipe laid across my deeded land. drawing on a spring with a priority date older than Diane's parents. The more I learned about Roy's financing, and a man at the county assessor's office who had gone to school with Carol told me more than he probably should have, the clearer it became that the whole development was leveraged against those premium Fountain View lots. Roy had borrowed against water he did not own. That was the thing under the thing. That was why Diane wanted my pond so badly she would invent a jurisdiction to get it. By the second winter, my pond was visibly lower. A spring-fed pond in this country holds steady through a normal year, rising with snowmelt, settling in late summer, but never dropping the way mine dropped that fall. Because mine now had a 4-inch straw in its low corner, pulling water downhill 20 hours a day to keep a stone fountain spitting for the benefit of 40 premium lots. I could hear the difference at night when the wind was right. A low, steady draw from the corner of the pond, the sound of my own water leaving. The willow at the south bank, Carol's willow, stood 18 inches above a water line it had touched for 60 years. The first ring of stones my grandfather had set at the basin edge sat high and dry, gray, where they had been dark and wet my whole life. Maddie noticed it before I said anything. She came in from the bank one evening, quiet, and said the water was below the second root again. And I understood that she had been measuring it the way I taught her, against a fixed mark every few days, keeping her own column of numbers. She showed me the page. She had dated every entry and noted the weather, the way a good record keeper does, so that no one could later claim the drop was only the dry summer. I added her measurements to the folder beside my own. The pond had dropped 14 inches in 5 months. I wrote that number down and I underlined it. 14 inches. A natural dry year takes 3, maybe 4. The other 10 inches were going up the hill to the fountain. And now I had a 16-year-old's dated, weather-noted, twice-saved record proving it. The fines kept coming through all of it, which tells you something about the kind of mind that runs a thing like the Stillwater Ridge Board. They were draining my pond and billing me for the privilege. The paper total crossed $3,000 that spring. There was a notice threatening a lien on my property, which is a thing a homeowners association you do not belong to cannot do. And I filed it with a note in the margin recording exactly why it was void. Diane began telling the other residents that I was a difficult old man hoarding water during a drought, and a few of them believed her. And one afternoon, a retired couple from the development, the Hargroves, drove up to ask me, more in sorrow than in anger, why I wouldn't share. They were not bad people. They had been lied to. Mr. Hargrove stood at my gate with his hat in his hands and said he didn't like to bother a neighbor. But the board had told everyone that I was sitting on a private lake and refusing to let the community use a single gallon. And that during a dry summer, that hardly seemed neighborly. I asked him to walk down to the fence with me. He hesitated, then came. I showed him the dropping water line against the mark on the willow. 18 inches of dry bank that had been underwater every summer of my life. I showed him the 4-inch pipe laid across my ground and the intake screen sunk in my shallows. Then I drove up to the house and brought down the development's own permit and put it in his hands and let him read it himself. The line where it authorized a recirculating fountain and not one drop of new supply. I watched a decent man's face change as he understood that the fountain he had paid an extra $40,000 to live beside was running on stolen supply, and that the difficult old man was not hoarding a lake, but watching his pond get siphoned dry while the people doing it billed him for the privilege. He did not say much. He took a photograph of the pipe before he left, though, and he asked for my phone number, and I gave it to him. His wife, Ruth, took my hand at the truck and apologized for coming up the way they had. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. People who are lied to are not the liars. That was the turn, though I didn't know it yet. The case had a witness now who lived inside the development. The third year is when Diane crossed the line that let me finish it. The pond had dropped so far by August that the intake screen at the low corner began sucking air, and the fountain at the entrance started to stutter and spit mud. And Roy needed more water faster than the failing intake could give it. So one Thursday morning, the 15th of August, at 7:40 in the morning, a crew of 3 men I had never seen came through the gap in my fence with a small excavator on a trailer and began digging a deeper sump in the shallows of my pond, on my land, to drop the intake lower. Maddie saw them first from the kitchen window, and she did exactly the right thing. She did not go outside. She called me at the barn, her voice tight and fast. "Dad, there are men in the pond. There's a digger. They're on our side." And I told her to stay in the house, lock the door, and film it from the window. And she did. Both phones, both drives. I walked down to the fence, calm. And I told the crew foreman they were on private property and digging in a decreed water body without authority, and that I was recording it. He told me he had a work order from Pruitt Construction. I asked to see it. He showed me a printed sheet with Roy's logo. I photographed it. Then I called the deputy, Cole, and I told him I now had a trespass, an unpermitted excavation in a decreed water body, and a documented pattern 3 years deep. And I gave him the incident count off the top of my head. It was 41. Cole came out within the hour. He read my folder on the hood of his cruiser, page by page, in date order. And I watched the same change come over his face that had come over Mr. Hargrove's. He had the work order, my photographs, the permit showing no authorized supply, the survey of the pipe 11 feet inside my line, and 3 years of dated overreach stacked under it. He stopped the excavation that morning. He did it politely, the way a constrained man does a thing he is finally free to do. And he told the foreman to pull the equipment off my land and not come back. And the foreman, who was just a man doing a job, did it. Stopping the dig was not the reckoning, though. The reckoning came 3 weeks later, in a public room, with the document on the table. The county had scheduled a hearing on Stillwater Ridge's request to expand its water permit, because the fountain and the new homes needed more than the development was authorized to use. And Roy had applied to the state engineer's office, my old office, for additional supply. The hearing was open to the public. I put on a clean shirt, I brought the folder, and I brought one more thing: the decree itself, the original 1952 adjudication with my grandfather's spring. Listed by priority date, certified copy, recorded. The paper that man drove 40 miles to file, because he understood that water you cannot prove is water you do not own. Maddie came with me. She sat in the second row in her good jacket, and she did not take her eyes off me. Diane was there in magenta, and Roy beside her in a blazer that did not fit a builder, and their lawyer, and a row of residents, the Hargroves among them. The state engineer's representative ran the hearing, a woman named Okafor, who I did not know, the job having turned over since my time. Roy's lawyer made the case for the expanded permit, talking about community benefit and growth and the fountain as a public amenity. Diane spoke. She told the room that the Stillwater Ridge community had developed the water resources of the ridge responsibly, and that a single uncooperative landowner was obstructing the public good. She used the word jurisdiction again. She said the pond was functionally part of the community system. It was the third time I had heard her say it in 3 years. And this time, she said it under oath, into a microphone, in front of the official record. Then the representative asked if anyone wished to speak in response, and I stood up. I did not make a speech. I have heard 100 men lose cases by making speeches. A speech is a thing you give when you do not have the paper. I walked to the table at the front of the room. and the heels of my boots were the only sound in it. And I laid down the certified decree, squared to the edge of the table the way my grandfather squared everything. I laid beside it my survey of the pipe, 11 feet inside my deeded line, drawn to scale and signed. I laid beside that the development's own permit, the one authorizing no new supply, with the relevant line marked. 3 papers in order. Then I said only this, that the spring feeding my pond held a priority date of 1951, decreed in 1952, senior to every claim on that ridge by 70 years, and that the development had been drawing on it without authority for 2 years through a pipe laid across my private land. Then I stepped back and let the paper do the work. I had spent 31 years watching paper do the work. It does not need help. Ms. Okafor read the decree. She read it the way I used to read them, slowly, checking the date and the seal and the recording stamp, running a fingertip down the priority column. The room got very quiet, the particular quiet of people who have just felt the ground shift under a story they believed. She looked up at Roy's lawyer and asked a single question: where the development's water came from, if its permit authorized no new supply, and the senior right on the ridge belonged to the gentleman standing in front of her. The lawyer opened his folder and closed it again. He did not answer, because there was no answer. Roy started to talk about the easement, half rising from his chair, and Ms. Okafor asked him, evenly, to produce it. And he could not, because as I had known from the first day, it did not exist. Diane said the word jurisdiction one more time, weaker now, her hand going to the pearls at her throat. And a woman whose entire authority had been a costume understood. In front of the neighbors she had ruled for years that she had none. The Hargroves were in the 3rd row. I saw Ruth Hargrove fold her hands in her lap and look at the floor. The numbers on the table told the whole story to anyone who could read them. My side of the ledger, in 31 years of examining and a lifetime of owning, was 0. 0 fines lawfully owed. 0 permits violated. 1 decree, recorded 70 years ago, clean. Their side, read into the same record that afternoon, was a development drawing on an unpermitted source, a 4-inch pipe 11 feet inside a private line, a pond drawn down 14 inches, 3 years, and 41 documented incidents of overreach, and a fountain that was, as of that hearing, running on water that did not belong to them and never had. Ms. Okafor denied the permit expansion from the bench and referred the unpermitted diversion to the State Engineers Enforcement Division. The enforcement order came down 6 weeks later. It directed Stillwater Ridge to cease all diversion from my pond immediately and to remove its infrastructure from my land. And here is the part I had been waiting 3 years and a whole career to be entitled to do. The order required them to remove their pipe. The pipe crossed my land, though. And the law that lets a senior right holder protect his source also let me, on my own ground, sever an unpermitted diversion already declared unlawful. I did not need their crew, and I did not need to wait. On a clear Saturday morning in October, with the enforcement order in my hand and Maddie filming from the bank, I walked to the fence with a pipe cutter, knelt at the 4-inch line they had forgotten was sitting on my deeded dirt, and I cut it. Clean. The water that had been climbing the hill to feed their fountain stopped climbing. It ran back into my pond, where it had run for 70 years, and within a week, the water line had risen past the second root of Carol's willow. And within a month, it touched the mark my grandfather's basin had always held. The fountain at the entrance to Stillwater Ridge went dry that same week. There was no other water to feed it. The 3-tier stone basin that had thrown a plume you could see from the county road sat still, and then began to collect leaves and a green skin of algae. And the light still came on at night and lit up nothing but wet stone. The premium lots that backed the fountain green stopped selling because a dry stone basin full of leaves is not worth $40,000 extra. It is a liability with a maintenance bill. Roy's financing, leveraged against those lots, came due against an amenity that no longer ran. The man at the assessor's office told me later that the bank had built the whole loan around the appraised value of the fountain frontage. When the fountain died, the appraisal died with it. Within the year, Pruitt Construction filed for bankruptcy protection, and the development's remaining lots were sold off by a court-appointed trustee, and the Homeowners Association reorganized under new residents who wrote me a short, embarrassed letter asking only that I accept their apology, which I did. Mr. Hargrove signed it. Diane was not on the new board. The last I heard, she and Roy had moved out of the valley to somewhere with no water rights to Miss Reed. She lost, specifically and exactly, the things she had tried to take. She had wanted my water to run her fountain, and in the end the fountain ran dry and the water stayed mine. And there was no part of that I had to do to her. She did it to herself the day she decided not to read the decree. I never raised my voice at her once. I never had to. Maddie is 19 now and studying hydrology at the State University, which I did not push her toward and could not be prouder of. She says the field is mostly old men who talk too much and not enough people who keep a clean column of numbers. And I told her the field has been waiting for her whole life. She came home that first summer after her freshman year, and the two of us sat on the south bank in the evening with the pond full and level, and the willow's roots back under water, the swallows cutting the surface the way they did when her mother sat in that same spot. She said she still had every photograph, both drives, all 3 years, the golf cart and the stakes and the pipe and the dropping line, dated and weather noted. I told her to keep them. You never know. She laughed and said that was the most me thing I had ever said. And then she was quiet a while. And she said she missed her mom. And I said I did too. And the water sat full and dark in front of us, holding both of those things at once. Carol's willow has its feet wet again. The pond is full. The land is ours, the way it has been since a man came home from a war and dug a basin by hand and then, being careful, drove to town and wrote it down. So here's the lesson, plainly, because somebody out there is standing where I stood. If you own water, or a road, or a boundary, or any old thing your family fought for, find the paper before anyone challenges it, not after. Go to the county recorder and pull your deed and your decree and your survey and read them. And know your priority date and your acreage and your lines down to the foot. Keep a folder. When someone hands you a notice, do not argue with them and do not pay them. Write down the date and the time and exactly what they said, and file it, and photograph everything, and save it to 2 places. Calm and complete beats loud and angry every single time, because the law is slow, but it is not blind. And a clean record older than the claim against it will win in any room in this country. Do not show your hand. Do not pay a fine to a board that has no authority over you. And do not argue with it either. Just record it and file it. Let them commit to the position they cannot defend. And then lay the paper on the table and step back. If you have a story like this, a fence, a gate, a well, a right-of-way, somebody in a blazer who decided your land was theirs, tell me about it in the comments, because I read them and there is always something to learn from how another careful person held their ground. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one. And next time, I'm going to tell you about a retired surveyor whose HOA paved a private road across his easement and then tried to charge him a toll to use the road his own grandfather had deeded, and what he found rolled up in a tube in his father's gun cabinet that ended it in an afternoon. Take care of your records. I will see you then.